While the spotlight at this month's 15% Pledge fundraising gala was meant to fall squarely on the quiet dignity of Black-owned business equity and the well-deserved Trailblazer Award bestowed upon Tina Knowles, one fleeting sidelong glance and the softest of stifled laughs from within her own carefully assembled circle has left the Montecito chatelaine looking less like the commanding philanthropist she so clearly intended to embody, and far more like the unwitting centerpiece of an evening that was never quite hers to own. I'm glad you've joined me as we begin to unpick the layers of this development. Picture the scene on the evening of the 7th of February at Paramount Studios in Los Angeles, where the mint green carpet had been rolled out with the sort of understated precision that only true Hollywood insiders can manage, the air thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the low hum of conversation among those who genuinely belong in such rooms. The former actress arrived not quietly, not with the graceful restraint one might expect from someone who has spent years insisting she seeks only privacy and purpose, but in a manner that announced itself long before she stepped onto the carpet. A sleek security detail moving in practiced formation, the flash of cameras catching the dramatic sweep of that oyster-white Harbison studio gown, its sweetheart neckline edged in sharp black piping, and above all the voluminous black velvet shawl that trailed behind her like an oversized comforter, billowing with every calculated step as though determined to claim more space than the evening's theme had allotted. One can only imagine the inner monologue playing behind that practiced smile as she made her entrance, the quiet chant of validation she must have repeated to herself in the back of the car. Finally, the right cause, the right room, the right gown, a moment that would prove once and for all that she had seamlessly transitioned from royal duty to Hollywood relevance, that the years of scrutiny had only sharpened her into this poised, philanthropic force. Yet around her the atmosphere carried a different pressure, the subtle atmospheric shift that occurs when one guest's arrival feels just a fraction too orchestrated, too insistent, while others, Kelly Rowland, Winnie Harlow, Emma Grede herself, slipped in with the effortless discretion of those who need no fanfare to affirm their place. Before we begin to separate the quiet truths from the very loud fictions, I advise you to subscribe and turn on notifications. It serves as your direct line to the reality behind the royal facade. A source within the inner circle, someone who has watched these overlapping Los Angeles sets for years, later remarked on how the very scale of her entrance created an unintended distance, the kind of visual dominance that in royal days had been an asset, but here, among genuine industry players who prize understatement as much as impact, read instead as a quiet miscalculation, a reminder that the ladder of reinvention can sometimes elevate one just high enough to be seen from every angle. And then came the mingling, that signature habit of reaching out to touch wrists and hands as she spoke, fingers lingering a second longer than convention might dictate, gestures that some might interpret as warm engagement, the instinctive warmth of a woman who has always used physical connection to bridge gaps, yet which others, watching more closely, sensed carried the faint tremor of someone still calibrating her footing in a room where alliances are measured in subtler currencies. One can almost hear her internal calculation in those moments, the steadying breath beneath the laughter, the determination to anchor every conversation, to control the narrative through proximity because the alternative, standing apart, merely present, had become too risky after so many public recalibrations. The surrounding pressure was palpable. The watchful eyes of Chairwoman Emma Grede, the polite smiles of attendees who had read the same headlines about +1 status and unlisted invitations, the faint electric charge that runs through any charity gala when one figure's presence raises the unspoken question of whether she was truly invited or simply determined to be there. Long-term, of course, these arrivals matter more than the tabloids ever admit. They set the tone not just for a single night, but for the slow erosion or reinforcement of a personal brand that now depends so heavily on being seen as effortlessly at home in every philanthropic circle, every networking salon, every Instagram story curated to suggest belonging. A well-placed source close to those overlapping entertainment and beauty worlds whispered later that the very boldness of the entrance, the trailing velvet that demanded its own spotlight, had already begun to create the sort of quiet separation that no amount of posed selfies with Emma Grede could quite close, a distance that would echo in future invitations, or the lack of them when the gloss of the evening had faded. And yet, for those first 90 minutes, the evening appeared to unfold exactly as she must have rehearsed it in her mind. Photographs on the step and repeat, the soft click of approval from those who recognized the black-owned designer choice as both strategic and sincere, the low murmur of conversation that seemed on the surface to welcome her into the fold. She moved through the room with that practiced glide, the chignon sleek, the diamond and onyx earrings catching the light just so, and one could almost feel the quiet triumph in her posture, the inner voice assuring her that this was the reset, the proof that Montecito's isolation had not diminished her pull, that the absence of her husband that night was not a statement but simply a scheduling detail in a life now devoted to independent purpose. The atmosphere around her remained deceptively normal at first, the sort of polished goodwill that charity events are designed to project, champagne flutes raised in quiet toasts to equity and perseverance, the distant applause for Tina Knowles's acceptance speech filtering through from the main stage. But then, as she paused in one particular cluster of conversation, back turned momentarily to a small group of fellow guests, something shifted in the microdynamics of the room, the kind of atmospheric pressure change that only those paying close attention would register. A phone discreetly raised, a glance exchanged, the briefest softening of expressions into something that hovered between amusement and recognition. A long-time family acquaintance, still moving in these circles with the discretion that preserves access, would later describe how that single moment felt less like coincidence and more like the release of accumulated tension, the sort of fleeting indulgence that insiders permit themselves when the spotlight has moved just far enough away. And in that instant, the long-term consequences began to crystallize, not in headlines yet, but in the subtle recalibration of alliances, the quiet mental note taken by those whose support she would one day need again. That even in a room full of allies, the Montecito brand architect remained, at some fundamental level, an observer still learning the unspoken rules of a world that smiles warmly but laughs softly when the cameras are not quite watching. The evening was far from over, yet already the first whispers had begun to circulate among those who had seen the exchange. The first quiet acknowledgement that something in the carefully staged narrative had slipped, just enough to invite the sort of scrutiny that no velvet train, however dramatic, could fully conceal. A source behind closed doors, someone who moves effortlessly between these overlapping Los Angeles sets and still maintains quiet ties to palace circles from years gone by, described the laughter not as outright malice, but as the sort of pitying exhale that comes when one has seen the same pattern repeat itself too many times. The gesture of a group that has grown accustomed to the former actress's need to dominate every interaction, yet remains unwilling to confront it directly. And here the wrist-holding habit, so prominently captured in the wider footage from the evening, takes on a new layer of meaning when replayed in this context. Those lingering touches on arms and hands, that some interpret as the warm, engaging style of a woman who values connection above all, yet which others, viewing through a more cynical lens, see as the subtle manifestation of insecurity or an attempt to exert a quiet control over conversations that might otherwise drift away from her narrative. One can sense the internal pressure she must have felt even as she smiled and reached out, the determination to hold the moment, to anchor the attention, because the alternative, standing as just another guest, without the entourage or the dramatic cape, had become unthinkable after so many recalibrations of her public image. The long-term fracture this single exchange exposes within her post-royal social circle is impossible to overstate. If these were truly the close confidants she presents in carefully edited Instagram stories, would such a moment have been allowed to breathe, let alone be captured and allowed to circulate among the very people whose approval she still so clearly craves? A long-time family acquaintance who has observed her navigation of these worlds for years noted with quiet resignation that the laughter carried less cruelty than exhaustion. The weary recognition that the Montecito brand architect continues to perform belonging in rooms where others simply inhabit it, a pattern that has begun to wear thin, even among those who once extended the warmest of welcomes. The question that now hangs in the air, unspoken in polite company yet impossible to ignore in the private group chats where the clip first proliferated beyond the tabloids, is whether this was mere coincidence or the gentlest of inside jokes at the expense of a woman who has spent years insisting she seeks only authenticity and service. Someone close to palace circles, who still moves in these overlapping LA sets, confided that the exchange felt less like deliberate mockery and more like the involuntary release valve among people who have witnessed the same script play out at polo matches, award luncheons, and now charity galas, the arrival that demands notice, the gestures that seek to command, the narrative that insists on centrality in spaces that value subtlety above all. In that atmosphere of polite but watchful goodwill, where every smile is measured and every glance carries weight, the soft laugh served as a quiet acknowledgement that the performance, however polished, had not quite landed as intended, leaving the former actress oblivious in the moment, yet subtly diminished in the eyes of those whose support she would later need for brand deals, podcast renewals, or the next carefully staged philanthropic outing. Long-term, this is the sort of ripple that does not make the front pages but erodes quietly from within, the slow cooling of invitations, the polite deferrals, the sense that the Hollywood welcome she so publicly celebrates may be thinner than the velvet of that dramatic cape suggested. And so the clip moved with remarkable speed from a private recording into the wider currents of gossip and commentary, seeding the quiet doubt that her place in these circles is perhaps more aspirational than assured, that the absence of her husband that night, whether by design or by his reported reluctance to share yet another awkward spotlight moment, only amplified the impression of a solo campaign that was beginning to show its seams. The Montecito household, one imagines, awoke the following morning to the usual curated narrative of triumph on her social channels. Yet behind the scenes, the atmosphere must have carried a different pressure. The faint chill of knowing that not every laugh in the room had been with her, and that in the merciless economy of 2026 celebrity, such micro-rejections accumulate into the sort of reputational drift that no amount of strategic hand-holding can fully arrest. The evening, which had opened with such promise, had quietly closed on a note of subtle exclusion, planting the seed that the world she has worked so hard to re-enter may be watching her with a more skeptical eye than she realizes, and that the friends who once stood beside her on red carpets are now, in certain unguarded moments, allowing themselves the smallest of smiles at her expense. One can almost feel the internal monologue shifting in those first 48 hours, the steadying breath turning to something more resolute, the determination to frame every captured moment as triumph, even as the viral clip of the sidelong laugh and the wrist-holding gestures replayed across comment sections with increasing frequency, each loop reinforcing the impression of a performance that had not quite convinced the room. The surrounding atmosphere carried the weight of unspoken hierarchies, the quiet judgment of those for whom philanthropy is less about optics and more about lived consistency, the faint chill that settles when new money aspiration meets the understated codes of established circles and finds itself measured, weighed, and found just a fraction wanting. Long-term, the consequences for brand deals and the viability of future podcast seasons are already beginning to crystallize. When the perception of gate crashing begins to stick, when the narrative shifts from welcomed guest to determined presence, the invitations that once flowed so readily start to thin. The collaborative opportunities that depend on perceived authenticity begin to carry an invisible asterisk, the sort of reputational drift that no amount of strategic hand-holding or velvet cape drama can fully arrest. And threading through it all was the conspicuous absence of her husband, the Duke of Sussex, whose decision to remain in Montecito that evening has been described by a longtime family acquaintance as less about scheduling and more about a growing reluctance to share yet another awkward red carpet moment. The private embarrassment perhaps felt in the quiet hours at home when footage like this surfaces, and the carefully maintained image of joint purpose begins to fray at the edges. In the Montecito household, one pictures the atmosphere of quiet distance that has become increasingly familiar. The inner pressure on both sides, her determination to prove independence, his dawning awareness that these solo campaigns carry diminishing returns, that the world they left behind in Britain may have been replaced by one that smiles warmly on camera, but reserves its truest judgments for the moments the lens is elsewhere. A source behind closed doors, familiar with the overlapping entertainment sets she has courted so assiduously, noted the transactional undertone in her connections to figures in the beauty and media industries linked to higher-profile names, alliances that serve a purpose in the moment, yet rarely deepen into the sort of unshakable loyalty that survives scrutiny. The subtle recalibration that occurs when those same contacts witness the hand-clinging gestures replayed alongside past charity moments where similar patterns emerged, the instinctive reach for connection that once read as warmth, now increasingly interpreted as the quiet signal of someone still seeking her footing. The broader social standing, so painstakingly rebuilt since the departure from royal life, now faces the sort of slow erosion that gossip videos accelerate without ever quite naming, the perception that even in rooms filled with allies like Kelly Rowland and Winnie Harlow, the former actress remains, at some fundamental level, an observer performing centrality rather than inhabiting it, the long-term implication being a gradual cooling of the very circles whose validation her brand requires most acutely. This is the pattern that has begun to define the Sussex reinvention in 2026, the quiet accumulation of micro-rejections that no Instagram story of laughing with Emma Greed can fully obscure, the inner resolve hardening into something almost defiant, while the external pressure mounts, the knowledge that every gala, every gesture, every carefully chosen gown now carries the risk of becoming the next piece of evidence in a narrative of subtle exclusion. Yet still she presses forward, the Montecito brand architect refusing to acknowledge the chill that has begun to settle around the edges of her carefully constructed world, even as her husband's absence speaks volumes in the silence it leaves behind. A marital dynamic where one partner senses the diminishing returns of these public performances and chooses distance rather than participation. The crashing narrative, then, is not merely about one evening's laughter, but about the larger question of whether the Hollywood welcome she has courted so publicly was ever quite as warm as the photograph suggested, whether the friends who pose so obligingly on the step and repeat are the same ones exchanging glances when the back is turned, and whether the long-term viability of the entire enterprise now hinges on an ability to navigate rooms where not every smile is an invitation and not every alliance is built to last. The days following the gala have only sharpened that question, turning a single soft laugh into a mirror held up to the fragility of a reinvention that continues against mounting evidence to insist on its own effortless success. Yet beneath the surface gloss of those Instagram stories and the carefully worded statements that followed the gala, the deeper Hollywood reality has begun to assert itself with the sort of quiet inevitability that only those who have watched such reinventions play out over decades can truly appreciate. The Montecito chatelaine remains, at her core, an outsider in the very circles she has courted with such determination since trading royal protocol for California sunshine, her presence tolerated rather than embraced, her every gesture now subject to the sort of micro-scrutiny that turns a trailing velvet cape into a symbol of overreach and a soft laugh into evidence of subtle alienation. One pictures her in the stillness of the Montecito estate, in the small hours after the event, perhaps seated at the long dining table with a single lamp burning, the inner monologue unspooling like a reel of film she cannot pause. They smiled, but did they mean it? Those glances held a fraction too long. The hands I reached for, pulled back just enough. Was the gown too much, the entrance too bold? Or is this simply the price one pays when the world you left behind still whispers your name in rooms you can no longer enter uninvited? The emotional toll must be considerable for a woman who once commanded global stages with the effortless authority of her royal station, now reduced to reading every exchanged glance as potential rejection. Every polite conversation as a performance she must sustain alone. The financial pressure mounting in tandem as the Sussex brand, that carefully monetized blend of philanthropy, podcasting, and lifestyle ventures, relies so heavily on the optics of belonging, on the perception that she moves through these philanthropic salons as a natural insider rather than a determined aspirant whose invitations arrive with invisible asterisks. A source behind closed doors, someone who has observed the ebb and flow of these intersecting Los Angeles worlds for years, remarked with quiet candor that the laughter captured that night was merely the audible crack in a facade already showing signs of strain, the sort of atmospheric cooling that settles over once welcoming circles when repeated patterns of dominance begin to fatigue even the most patient of hosts. The long-term consequence being a slow, almost imperceptible erosion of credibility that no amount of curated content can reverse. The decades stretching ahead marked by invitations that grow fewer, collaborations that carry heavier caveats, and a brand narrative that increasingly struggles to outrun the whispers it was meant to silence. The cooling atmosphere of those salons is palpable now in ways it was not 6 months ago. The subtle recalibration among figures in beauty and media who once extended the warmest of welcomes, yet now maintain a polite distance, their alliances revealed as transactional rather than foundational, the pattern repeating itself from polo fields to award luncheons to this latest charity gathering, where the absence of her husband spoke volumes in the silence it left behind. One can sense the quiet marital dynamic playing out behind the Montecito gates, his reported reluctance to participate in yet another spotlight moment, perhaps born of a dawning recognition that these solo campaigns yield diminishing returns, her resolve hardening in response as she insists the path forward lies in proving independence, yet the pressure builds in the shared spaces of their life together. The knowledge that the ladder they climbed together in those early days of departure has left toes stepped upon that may indeed be the very ones required on the descent. The old adage taking on a sharper edge in 2026 when every misstep is recorded, every laugh archived, and the ascent that once seemed unstoppable now carries the faint echo of future reckonings. A longtime family acquaintance who has watched this trajectory unfold with the discretion that preserves access, confided that the real fracture lies not in malice but in exhaustion, the weary acknowledgement among those who once stood beside her on red carpets that the performance of belonging has begun to outpace the reality of acceptance, the financial scaffolding of the Sussex enterprise, the deals, the speaking fees, the carefully branded initiatives now resting on optics that grow more fragile with each viral clip, each sidelong glance that travels beyond the room and into the wider court of public opinion, where women of a certain discernment see through the velvet and the hand-holding to the underlying insecurity it seeks to conceal. In the merciless spotlight of 2026 celebrity, where algorithms reward authenticity yet punish the slightest whiff of contrivance, Not every gala smile is sincere, and not every trailing shawl conceals the chill of subtle exclusion, a truth that has never been more evident than in the quiet aftermath of this single evening when the noble cause of equity was momentarily overshadowed by the human comedy of a woman who believed she had finally arrived only to discover the room had already moved on without her. The gravity of the situation lies not in scandal or outright rejection, but in the cumulative weight of these micro-moments, the slow accumulation of doubt that undermines the very foundation of the reinvention she has staked so much upon, the emotional and reputational toll that no security detail or dramatic entrance can ultimately shield against, leaving her to navigate a landscape where the friends who laugh softly behind backs may one day be the same ones whose support she requires most desperately on the way back down. And so we return to the heart of the matter, that fleeting exchange of glances, and that soft, knowing laugh which has become far more than a viral curiosity. It has become a quiet mirror, held up to the fragility of a carefully constructed world, a reminder that in the rarefied air of Hollywood philanthropy, the performance of power can sometimes reveal only the performance itself, the long-term consequences echoing far beyond one February night into the years that will test whether the Montecito brand can withstand the gentle but persistent erosion of belief in its own narrative. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write. And if you value this unvarnished look at the monarchy and the worlds that orbit it, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth.